Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Welcome, all my weirdos and weirdettes, to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I'm delighted that you could join us for this episode. I am very, very excited about the guest that we're having join us tonight. I've been meaning to get him on this show since it started. He's from my home country, Australia. He's an environmental consultant, a radio broadcaster, a teacher, author, and International Athena Foundation Earth Champion. He is the author of Australian Cryptozoology, which I only just read, to be honest. I should have read it. It's been out, I think, for a little while. You can get it on Kindle. It's a great book. I read it just today, just jam-packed with fantastic information about Australian cryptids and the like, and written in a very balanced, very articulate, very readable way. And he also wrote Understanding Humans and Extraterrestrials, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to have to read that shortly. He's appeared on several US, Australian, Canadian, and UK documentaries and podcasts. You've probably seen him on a number of them. I know I have. He's been interviewed as an expert on Yowies, which is Australia's own Bigfoot-like cryptid, thylacines and great goannas, among other creatures. These programs have included Doug Hajicek, who, of course, is the founder and head of the Untold Radio Network. He has a fantastic show, MONSTERQUEST, as well as Finding Bigfoot and BOOGEYMEN, all fantastic shows. He's a frequent presenter at Australia's classic NEXUS Magazine Conferences. They're great. I've been to some of them myself, and various other Australian cons. He's an environmental consultant with a field research and public relations career spanning 55 years. He's lectured on botany, zoology, geography, ecology, permaculture, and I could go on and on and on. This man is an expert on multiple things. He truly is a polymath. He's also the wildlife expert environmental consultant for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, North Coast New South Wales Radio on 94.5 FM, and he has a weekly talkback radio broadcast at 6:40 a.m. every Saturday morning, which has been broadcasting since February 1997. So I'm delighted to welcome to Talking Weird a long overdue guest, Gary Opit. Greetings, Gary.
Hello, Dean.
It's wonderful to have you here. I've been meaning to have you on the show for so long, so I finally got you here.
Yes, so here I am in the great Southland, the land down under Australia. And of course, I'm broadcasting from the easternmost point in Australia, which is in northeast New South Wales, Byron Bay. And we're in the traditional lands of the Bundjalung, Aboriginal First Nation people, who have existed on this continent for something maybe 80 to 100,000 years. And the names of most of our cryptozoological animals as yet unclassified by science, generally have indigenous, Aboriginal or First Nation names.
You know, before we jump into Yowie stuff, which I was about to do, that is a point you make in your book regarding the Aboriginal traditional residents of Australia. You make the very interesting point that their myth cycle system, the dreaming, has all these interesting connections to modern ideas in quantum physics. Could you talk a little bit about that? I found that fascinating. I didn't expect to find that in the book, to be honest.
Yes, and look at the dreaming is the true Australian mind or consciousness. It's the First Nations description of reality, and it's spot on as it accords with modern physics, quantum mechanics, etc. And that's the fact that, and which we know, though few people take notice of, that we're not the solid entities that we think we are. You can see my surface area, but you and I, of course, all the important parts are inside. If you could see us as we really are, you'd be amazed, because we're constructed out of all of these organisms. And as well as that, we're electromagnetic entities, because as quantum mechanics teaches us, the only thing that exists in the universe is movement, is energy, straight line energy, which comes from stars and ourselves, heat and light, and spiraling or circular energy, which is the atomic structures, and where they interact, they create modern reality, or they create reality or consciousness. So and so the universe consists entirely out of communication, and here we are communicating. There's no such thing. There's no other thing but communication. The universe is constructed entirely out of data or information, and everything else is a delusion, but an essential delusion so that we can survive. And the indigenous people understand that, and they understand that we are not walking around on a landscape. We are part of the living landscape. And as we know, there's only a single living entity in the known universe, and that's the surface of our planet, which is a single living entity that's absorbing energy from the sun and photosynthesizing with plants, and the animals and fungi recycle everything. And that's the only reason we exist. That's the reason we're talking at the moment. And so the Indigenous Australian people, they always say, you know, as they used to say years ago in the conservation movement, earth first. We have to take care of the environment because we are the environment. And as we know, if you live in a degraded, hostile environment, you yourself will be degraded and hostile. You can't be any possible other way. If you live in a serene and sane and healthy environment, you'll be healthy as well. And so all of the mental problems that beset modern humanity all come from a failure to understand that we are the environment. The environment must always come first, because the environment gives us the air to breathe and gives us the food to eat. And the other important thing is that we're a community. There is only communities. I'm a community of microorganisms, as you are, and every other animal and plant on the planet is. And all of these communities are communicating with each other. And there's no such thing really as independent thought, because I know that the community taught me to think. They taught me to read and write. And anything that I'm talking about today, I didn't make it up or discover it. The community of scientists and intelligent people and philosophers and everybody else, most important are the trash collectors and garbage collectors and sewage operators, who I wouldn't be able to survive if the farmers, everyone else, we're a big community. So there's no really such thing as independent thought in a way. What we're doing is community thought, and here we are doing it right this moment. We're a community, a global community, and we're communicating, and we're just communicating the community's consciousness. We cannot think beyond the community. A community consciousness is the only thing that exists, but of course it gets highly distorted and delusional, as we can see in parts of the world, tragically, where people begin to regard themselves as enemies or what have you, where in fact we're all extremely close, interacting individuals, and we have to survive, because the universe is a very violent, deadly place, and the only place in the known universe where there's any stable environment and any consciousness is right here. So the rarest thing in the universe is ourselves, and we are the aliens to every other potentially occurring life form throughout the universe. living planets are probably the rarest thing on Earth. So if there's any extraterrestrials listening on, they're seeing is too weird, the two bizarre aliens at the moment on this particular little screen that exist at the end of the universe. But and the Indigenous people, the Bundjalung people and other First Nation people of Australia, have a very profound understanding of reality, which is referred to as the dreaming. And so when the dreaming, you can think of that, you either have you either you sleep, you're awake, or when you dream, when you're asleep, you're either in a state of no dreaming or dreaming. So sort of dreaming is like consciousness, and so it's a beautiful term. And the dream time, consciousness over time, beautiful terms. And in Australia, thankfully, after about 235 years, the Indigenous people are finally being respected, and an understanding of their fabulous culture is finally being accepted.
That always makes me think, that idea of the dreaming makes me think, I think it's the Poe quote, which is something along the lines of, how do I know that all I see or seem is not but a dream within a dream? And that feeds into something you very graciously suggested we should mention, and that's your colleagues Tony Healy and Paul Cropper's The Yowie Files book, which has dropped recently. Because I haven't read that book yet, but I've read some reviews, and my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're probably more familiar with the book, is that this is a more metaphysical or paranormal type view, perhaps, of the entity or the creature that's the Yowie, the suggestion that this thing might be not just a simple physical cryptid, but might be something more complicated on a different spiritual or metaphysical level.
Yeah, look, it's very difficult to say. Remember that we're all investigators in one way or another, and I particularly investigate unclassified animals, and I only do that because I've encountered them myself, and because I've spent my life working in wildlife parks and working as an environmental consultant, undertaking fauna and flora surveys and ecological assessments as part of development applications that go before councils and things like that. And I got that work simply because there's very few people that are able to identify native plants and animals, and that's what I do with my radio show, which has been going on continuously 27 years. People phone me up and they play a sound, as I just I did last week. Someone, the actual host, Angela Caterns, on the radio, she played this very strange call that she recorded on a phone from a veranda at night, and of course it was a female fox. They have a very strange, it's not really a bark, it's a very bizarre call, and it's very unsettling when you hear it. But it's an introduced animal. We don't have native foxes. We have native carnivorous marsupials. And just a couple of words about Australia. For our American viewers, Australia is about the size of the United States, but as an island. So it's got coast all around it with beaches, and it sits between Antarctica and Indonesia, and the top third of it's tropical, and it includes vast areas of tropical rainforest and woodlands, some of the largest undisturbed wildernesses on Earth. Then the central third is sort of subtropical and temperate down towards the bottom, and Tasmania and New Guinea are two large islands south and north of Australia. And Australia's never been connected to Southeast Asia, so we do not have any Eurasian animals. So we have no squirrels or monkeys or apes or big cats or deer, elephants, rhinos, all of those animals. Our animals and plants are related to South America, because Australia was connected to Antarctica, South America, when it was a part of Gondwana. Africa, India and Madagascar were once part as well, but they broke away earlier. And so for about 50 million years, Australia has been moving north at a speed of 6 centimetres a year, heading towards Southeast Asia. And so the only animals that exist in Australia, native to the continent, have been here for many millions of years, come from South America, the marsupials, or Gondwana. South America is part of Gondwana. The incredibly ancient monotremes, the platypus, and the echidna, which are egg-laying mammals. And then, of course, we have some mammals that got across from Southeast Asia, basically bats and rats that came across millions of years ago, floating on logs or flying. So we've got many species of native rodents, but we have no native deer or native big cats or native apes. However, the British, when they settled Australia about 135 to 235 years, anyway, a long time ago now, 235 years ago, I think, 1788, they first arrived in Sydney Heads, the first fleet. And then over time, they introduced a whole lot of feral animals. So I've got a lot of feral animals in this country, including numerous species of deer, of water buffalo, wild cattle, wild horses, wild goats, wild pigs, foxes, and rabbits, all introduced. But the native Australian animals live amongst these exotic species. So that's a little rundown on the Australian ecosystem. And that's why an animal like the Yowie, majority of zoologists would refuse to believe such a thing could exist because it's part of the Asian fauna, say, if it's, Gigantopithecus or something related to gorillas or orangutans or something. But however, it could be a native animal, because Australia, and not many people know this from that live overseas, of course, away from Australia, but Australia up until maybe 30,000 years ago or so was dominated by giant marsupials, giant birds, giant reptiles, marsupial lions, giant tortoises, and a number of species that have since gone extinct. And so some of these animals that have been seen, such as Yowies, there's also the possibility that they're remnant megafauna, which is a lot more acceptable to, say, some zoologists than a species that's got across from Southeast Asia. So that's a little potted history of Australia.
And you suggest in the book that the bunyip, which I'd get you to explain for listeners who don't understand what that is, but you suggest that the bunyip might be some type of megafauna which is kind of evolved to suit its current circumstances.
Yeah. So the bunyip was one of the earliest discoveries or encounters by the first British settlers in Sydney, and then began to explore. And in 1912, the first report of a sea-like animal with a very loud voice lived in a lake to the south of Sydney. And then as explorers moved through Australia and European settlers began to take up land, the indigenous people, the First Nation people, warned them that there was a dangerous animal that could sometimes be seen in the rivers and lakes, and that it had a loud call, and that it was carnivorous, and it was about 3 meters long, covered in very sleek hair, dark brown, glossy hair. It was obviously an aquatic animal, and they warned people that it was dangerous to, say, wash if you've been eating, say, roast duck or something. If you've just recently shot a duck, don't go washing your hands in the lagoons and rivers, because it could attract one of these bunyips. And of course, there was many different names for these animals. And these animals were regularly encountered, and reports were made and published in local regional newspapers. And so the Australian community during the 18th century regularly ran reports of these bunyips. However, nothing was ever captured, and the animals were incredibly cryptic, and so they appeared to be more like a giant marsupial otter. And because they were described, and they were seen even in Melbourne, in Victoria, they were quite common. They lived right along the Murray-Darling River all the way up to Queensland, and they occasionally roared, but they're very rarely seen, and they would sunbake on logs hanging over the water, but at the slightest disturbance they would dive into the water, and they would display by splashing water up into the area, 2, 3, 4 meters, 12 feet they describe again and again. But most of these actual descriptions have only recently come to light because our Australian National Library has an internet site called Trove, TROVE.
It's great. And people should check out Trove. I only found it out recently. It's such a great site.
Yeah. And so you just have to put in bunyip, say, and you get all of these reports from regional newspapers that have never seen the light of day, in 100 years or so, because the big city newspapers stopped taking reports of these unknown animals. But there was 2 different kinds of bunyip. So there was the river bunyip or lake bunyip, which was a big otter-like animal, and it must have been an animal. We don't know anything about it all. There's no skeletal remains of it all. There's no fossil remains of it. It seemed to be always very rare and solitary. And if ever it was seen on the surface or on the land. It was known to come out on the land, and then there's even the odd reports of them chasing the odd person, but that seems to be more to, chase an intruder out of their territory. And then they disappear, and they lived in reed beds in particular, and also described living in hollow logs, but no bodies were obtained. It was always an incredibly rare animal, and I don't think there's been any reports of it since about the 1970s. However, most people won't report something that unusual they've seen like that. The scientists of the day thought they must be seals migrating up rivers, but it's highly unlikely that seals adapted for a lifestyle in the ocean, and the most important thing in every animal's life is the reproduction season, when they're carving out their territory on the beaches, and so the last thing they're going to do is be exploring thousands of kilometres upriver. So there's also a possibility with some species of native freshwater seal, but the identity of the bunyip is still unknown. And the other bunyip that existed was the mountain bunyip, and also known as the native gorilla, or the hairy man, or the Yowie, and there's many other sightings, reports and indigenous names for them. And the Yowie has been incredibly successful, so the reports are still coming in, even though there's no physical evidence of their existence, but they're very much like your North American Bigfoot or Sasquatch.
That's why that book I mentioned before from your colleagues Tom Healy and Paul Cropper, I have to read it, the Yowie Files. It reminds me of work here from people like Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner, who look at Bigfoot reports and various stories going back to, Native American times up until the present, that these things often behave more like almost something out of fairy faith or something which is paraphysical. Their book Where the Footprints End is literally, it's kind of, I suppose the very title suggests that sometimes you'll find these tracks just leading into a field or something, and boom, they stop in the middle of nowhere. So there's all these things which suggest a paraphysical nature, as do some of the native traditions. I know a lot of American native traditions suggest that these things have a more they have a physical component, but they also have a spiritual component.
Yes. Look, the only way we're really going to find out is if we can get DNA, and these days the sciences have increased to such a degree that now in Australia, and perhaps in the rest of the world, scientists can take a sample of water from the bushland or from a lake, or simply from the air. And in that sample will be the DNA of every animal that lives in that bushland. So the only trouble is if the Yowie is a close relative to people, so it's like a true hairy human, say a relict hominoid or hominin, as pioneering researchers Rex and Heather Gilroy believe that Yowies are Homo erectus, surviving populations of Homo erectus, whereas other people think that they're a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, which is an Asian ape and only known from 500,000 years ago or something in Asia, and it's only known from a few teeth, etc., teeth and the jawbone, but the animals described as like an enormous gorilla-like animal, but so if there's no DNA available, it shows you that the animal doesn't exist. So maybe it does have a paranormal reality to it, but the paranormal reality is not an explanation, because in any field of investigation, you have to, your investigation has to make sense and has to correlate with every other possible kind of investigation. So as an example, if some crime has been committed and the police come and investigate the crime scene, you've had someone, family member kidnapped, or or something stolen or whatever, and the police were to investigate and look for DNA, and they say, look, I'm afraid there's no physical entity, there's no physical evidence whatsoever. We can't find any DNA. So we've come to the conclusion that the criminal came from another dimension, and that's our official report. And your reaction to that would be, what? What, are you insane? What do you mean the criminal came from another dimension? Oh, I want this detective sacked, put on a real detective. And that's the trouble with cryptozoology. You can't really say, you can't really explain them away as, they come from another dimension, or they're paraphysical or paranormal or something, because those terms actually mean nothing. Like there's nothing behind them, like scientists, cosmologists and physicists and stuff say, there could be up to 11 other dimensions, but there's no sign of anything leaking through from one dimension to another. And if such a thing could occur, what else would come through? And why would a big hairy thing like a gorilla come through into another dimension or another phase of reality? Wouldn't everything else come through, like all kinds of microbes and bacteria and everything? And it would be devastating for our ecosystem. Suddenly everyone would get a terrible disease. And imagine the Yowie does come from another dimension, and it's a hairy animal, looks like a gorilla, acts like a gorilla, or a Gigantopithecus or a Homo erectus or something. And we know that every animal on Earth is covered in microbes and parasites. And in fact, every animal on Earth needs microbes in its gut to digest its food. So a cow can't digest grass without the microbes in its gut, and we can't digest our food without microbes in the gut. So if a thing like a gorilla is able to slip through from one dimension to another, well, how about the microbes that infest it, and the parasites and what have you? And theoretically, you could get a plague of alien microbes coming through, unless, of course, it doesn't have any kind of solid reality and it's purely an optical illusion or whatever. But unfortunately, none of those explanations offer really any answers. They're sort of almost a cop-out, so it'd be just like the detective saying, we can't find any evidence, so he must have come from a different dimension and nothing. So, because any form of investigation has to correlate with every other form of investigation. So if you're looking for one thing, you can't have an explanation that doesn't that can't be used for the investigation into anything else, no matter what it is. But yeah, we don't really know. That's why this is such an interesting subject, because there's no other subject on Earth that is as interesting, besides maybe ufology, and most of that takes place up in the air where you can't get at the things, whatever they are up there, and you can explain them away as secret military advanced devices, and that nothing to do with extraterrestrials or outer space or whatever. But the cryptozoology is fascinating because it's the only situation where ordinary people encounter pretty ordinary animals, even if it doesn't look like it's an escaped gorilla or looks like a Tasmanian tiger or a big black panther that shouldn't be there or something or other. Ordinary people encounter these ordinary animals in ordinary environments, like virtually in their backyards or in local bushland or forest, and there's no explanation for these animals, and there needs to be an explanation, because it could mean that we don't understand reality. Because I mean, something's leaking through that we can't explain, and it's these anomalies that drive science. So I mean, quantum mechanics was found because we believed we knew exactly how the universe worked with classic physics, and then we discovered that no, that there's a problem there. It doesn't work at all, and that the universe is not constructed out of clockwork matter. It's constructed out of energy movement, and so there must be perhaps there's an aspect of reality that we don't understand at all. One of the things to remember, we can only see a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is light and heat, but we can't see infrared or ultraviolet. And some insects and other animals can see that. But that electromagnetic spectrum, that continues to infinity on either side. So we only can view a tiny aspect of reality. And also the other thing we've discovered is that the visible detectable universe only makes up 4% of reality. They believe that something like 95% of reality is composed of dark energy and dark matter, 4% dark matter, which is, well, we don't know what it is, except the evidence shows that it's there, but we can't detect it in any way. So maybe these cryptozoological sightings have something to do with dark energy and dark matter. But then how come they only portray themselves as scary-looking gorilla-like things in the bush, and don't exhibit any other characteristics? And the other thing too is, why is it that these animals, if they do come from another dimension, I don't say they do or they don't, I just say I got no idea, why do they only appear in the natural habitat? Like you would think you would bump into, if they come from another dimension, you could encounter them in the local supermarket or in your office on the 27th floor of a skyscraper, because if they come from another dimension, they could appear almost anywhere there. They could appear in your main street of your city, but they're always deep in the bush. So that's another problem with this paranormal explanation. It doesn't fit the whole scene, really.
I think you had some answers yourself to why that might work, though, and that is in the book, and even now talking, the idea that the gap between us and the other, like in the dreaming, this reality and another dreaming might be, or another reality might be thinner than we think. And to use your police analogy, I love that analogy you brought up about how people would be like, you can't just explain a murder that it was some paranormal manifestation. But I have a similar analogy that I only used. I was chatting to somebody the other day, and the way ufology and cryptozoology and people who are interested in the paranormal and ghost hunting all operate reminds me of before the days there was any combined law enforcement overreach between different counties. Like if you had this police department over here looking at a killer, and it didn't talk to this police department over here looking at evidence which was similar to another killer, to this one across county lines, you would never have found the patterns in serial killers. I think what we're seeing in the broader UFO, because I think the UFO thing's related. This is what I love about talking weird. I can have these kind of whacked out conversations. I think the UFO phenomenon is related to the cryptozoological phenomenon and is related to the paranormal phenomenon. And that isn't just a wild hypothesis that I'm, I guess, plucking out of nowhere. It's because there are commonalities between many of these manifestations. The most obvious one is the lack of any physical evidence left behind. I mean, we can go down to comparing actually the way the phenomenon behaves, but the fact that none of these interests in the other, whether it's again UFOs or the paranormal or cryptids or whatever, there's never anything left. There's trace evidence in the way that we have footprints, or we might have, you know, a landing mark from a UFO, or we might have, you know, evidence that a ghost knocked something over, but there's never any lasting physical evidence. And you would think in one of these fields, particularly in cryptozoology, that there would be some body of a Sasquatch, or there would be some, you know, body of a dugong, not a dugong. We'll talk about dugongs in a minute, because that's something else you mentioned in relation to mermaids I found interesting. There'd be a body of a bunyip. There'd be something that would give us proof that these creatures were actually there. But it's the same as ufology and the paranormal. There's no physical evidence remaining that we can knock on the doors of the scientific institution and go, here you go, this is proof positive that we have one of these things.
Yes, there's the only other explanation that I can come up with, and that is, as I said, you know, our true reality is we're part of a larger organism, which is the living surface of the planet. And it's made up of all the different plants and animals, the ecosystems that absorb sunlight and recycle matter and energy. And so the living planet is a huge living organism. And of course, we know that we've always lived as part of that living organism. And we also know that we're consciousness. Everything's consciousness, everything's communication. So perhaps not only is there a combined physical reality to our existence, in that we're dependent upon the community of people and the community of animals and plants to exist, but perhaps there is a planetary mind in operation. And this planetary mind is known to actually exist to a degree, because they've found that the most conscious part of a plant, and plants are highly conscious, of course, is beneath the ground in their roots, where the bacteria and microbes of the plant cells interact with the fungus cells, all kinds of different kinds of species of fungus, and they work together, and the trees actually feed one another and take care and send messages to each other. And so beneath the ground, in the roots of all the trees, in the forests in particular, there's this enormous mind in operation that we're completely deaf to and blind to. We can't even hardly imagine that such a thing could exist. And so that would mean that there must be a planetary mind that's been in operation for millions upon millions of years, underground for a start, under the roots of the forests, because originally the planet was almost completely covered in forests before the ice ages and what have you, tropical forests. This was really a tropical planet. And then, of course, so the surface of the planet, all the animals and plants and the birds in the sky and everything else. And remember, the oxygen itself and the atmosphere is created by the plants and the animals. And the clouds are created by marine organisms, by marine algae, and they produce ammonia that goes up into that lifts the droplets of water vapor up into the air. So it's these amazing marine plants create the clouds that moderate the climate. Otherwise, the planet would be just getting too hot and too cold, and so life is totally in charge of the actual conditions of the planet, and it's all consciousness. And so perhaps there's an enormous conscious mind that includes our entire planetary global human mind and the planetary global plant and animal mind and fungal mind, etc. All as one single mind, which must exist because we are all members of a communicating species, living amongst other communicating species. And so maybe it's the planetary mind that's creating these images of flying saucers and aliens and unknown and unclassifiable animals. Though why it would do that is then a great mystery. But that's just another possibility, and another thing that has to be incorporated into trying to obtain answers as to why people are seeing things that can't be identified, and not simply shooting the messenger. Say, oh, I don't believe you for 1 second. You know, how could you have seen something I haven't seen? Yeah.
That planetary mind hypothesis is fascinating. Let's talk about some of your own experiences, because I'm sure our viewers and listeners would love to hear that. We'll hit the weirdest first. This is one that again, it wasn't something I was expecting in the book, and then maybe we'll go back to the Yowie before we finish. And that is, you saw something in Papua New Guinea, right? That was, in many ways, its head popped up like a mermaid. And at first you thought maybe it was a dugong, and then you were like, no, that wouldn't have been a dugong.
Yeah, so that's right. So I spent a couple of years altogether in the tropical island of New Guinea. New Guinea is the largest tropical island on Earth, and it rises up to 16,000 feet, I believe. There's a glacier up there, and it's composed of an enormous range of high altitude mountains and volcanoes. And then it drops down to a fabulous coral encrusted coast. It's inhabited by the most fabulous Melanesian people that sort of probably distantly related to Australian First Nation people. Papua New Guinea is one of my favourite places. It's magnificent. I haven't been there since '78, but and I spent a lot of time with a biologist from the Wow Ecology Institute, and which is a field station of the Bishop Museum of Hawaii, and we were on expeditions climbing mountains that hadn't climbed before and discovering new birds of paradise species, etc. And then and the whole place is relatively, especially in those days, relatively undisturbed. And I spent a lot of time living with people that had never seen an outsider before, and they thought I was a ghost. And then they'd make me a member of the tribe, and they'd blacken me with charcoal and pig grease, and I'd be covered in bird of paradise feathers, and with the other head people with my own bows and arrows and spears running through the jungle and joining in big ceremonies, all kinds of stuff. I've lived most of my life more in the wilderness than had very little to do with civilization, and so on this a coastal boat, so it's all rainforest right down to the water. In fact, it would overlap the reef and the fringing reefs, and it's crystal clear water, alive with fish. In those days there was no fishing going on, and I was studying the wildlife, as I always have all my life. I was at the bow of the boat watching, and we're 3-4 kilometers, say a mile or two off from shore. You can still see the shore, and this is along the north coast. We were traveling between Lay and Wewak, and along the north coast, and I saw this round head on the surface of the water, which looked just like a human head, a dark brown human head. And I thought, oh, was that a fisherman, or why would there be somebody? But that they only had the indigenous New Guinea people only had wonderful tree canoes, outrigger canoes cut out of fallen, cut out of big tree, rainforest tree, and they'd go out quite a ways. And I thought it might be a chap swimming, or fishing or something. I looked around, there was no sign of a boat anywhere, and we were rapidly approaching this round head. It was perfectly round, and then I was surprised, it suddenly ducked below the surface, and I went straight down. It didn't dive down like a dolphin or a dugong or anything. It just descended, and then the boat went right over it, and I was able to look down onto it, and the water was crystal clear, and it was descending tail first, and the whole animal was brown, and it seemed to have a dolphin-like tail and an elongated body. I mean, just like a dugong or a dolphin or something, except it was going down vertically, and I could see the sort of round head. But of course, looking through the surface of the water, even though it was relatively calm, you couldn't see any detail. Anyway, I could only surmise I must have been a dugong. Or we have another animal called the Irrawaddy dolphin, or short fin dolphin, which has only a very small dorsal fin and a head and a bit of a neck, and not much of a snout like, say, your normal bottlenose dolphin. And so I thought probably one of those two species, because I didn't believe for 1 second in mermaids or anything. And then when I got to shore, I was always talking, and I learnt the local language Pidgin, and I was always asked the locals, because we were doing fauna surveys, what animals they'd seen, and particularly interested in what rare animals they'd seen. And this one elderly New Guinean man told me how they were fishing once and they caught in the net a big animal and they pulled it to the surface and they were shocked, and they described a mermaid to me, but brown with big eyes with a human face, and a female with breasts. And I said, oh, that's a dugong. That's a dugong. And he goes, oh, no, we eat dugongs. We call them pig of the sea. No. This was what we call interesting. They call it a mermaid. They call it a sea Mary. In the Pidgin, the word for woman is Mary, probably from the missionaries. And so they use the word Mary, and he said, no, that's a sea Mary. They said, you know all about them, sort of thing, because we've seen them on tins of sardines or something, and it shows you a mermaid or something. And I was astounded, like, oh my God, I picked up a report of a mermaid. And you could tell, I didn't believe him at first, and he began to get upset at me because I was saying, oh, no, you're not telling me the truth. You can't possibly see something like that. And so I was really amazed to get a report of a mermaid. And then the International Society of Cryptozoology had some expeditions into the area, and they were able to photograph the tail of an animal that they said marine scientists, biologists were never able to identify, and that the locals, this is in New Ireland, which I spent a bit of time on New Ireland, the locals knew the animal very well, said, oh, no, it's different to the dugong. This feeds on fish, and it looks very much like an aquatic person, but with a tail like a dolphin. And then I looked up, I looked up other reports and found that similar reports had come from directly to the west of New Guinea, in the Spice Islands, Indonesian Spice Islands, also describing a similar animal. It was an American pilot or military member who was living on an island. I can't remember if he was shot down or something, or what he was doing, but he described the locals pulling up one of these animals and described it as looked, it was a true mermaid. And then the early accounts from hundreds of years ago, when the Portuguese and the Dutch were exploring the Spice Islands, just to the west of New Guinea, that's where other mermaid reports came from, and so there's the very remote possibility that it's some species of, and probably critically endangered if it ever existed, but some species of a totally aquatic ape. Wow. And the Bornean proboscis monkey have a very large nose, and they actually swim in the sea to a degree. So yeah, I mean, I find, I'm a skeptic, of course, like most people, but I'm always fascinated by the possibilities. And if you think, oh no, that's impossible, well, we're semi-aquatic chimpanzees, because we know that something like 96.4% of our DNA is pure chimpanzee D. I've read, and that our blood is identical to chimpanzee DNA. So all those racists out there or something or other, we're all chimps. We're not even humans. And all of our features that make us human comes from being an ability to swim. And as we know, where do we like to go on holidays? Lie on the beach and go swimming, which we wouldn't do if we've never had anything to do with the beach. And it's one of the reasons why we're so upright, because if you swim, you can't be hunched over like a gorilla or orangutan. You have to be very straight. We have this this is a hooded nose. That's for diving. If I didn't have that, I couldn't dive into the water. My face is covered in oil glands, which gives teenagers acne, and that's a waterproofing. So we've got a waterproof face, and our breathing tubes are reminiscent of dugongs. And we've got a layer of subcutaneous fat, which is the reason why we float. It's not to keep us warm, but because we float. So and our hair is puny. We've got as much hair as a chimp, only it's reduced. And what animals have reduced hairs? Only if you're a swimmer. And so it's been theorized that the genetics show us we all came from an individual or several individuals about 150,000 years ago, and there's theories that early Homo sapiens, which were a little bit bent over and not as large, quite as large brained as we are, and as flat faced and everything. Perhaps populations of them were forced to or lived on islands and did a lot of swimming and foraging. And of course, one of the best places to live, as we know, is along the sea coast, where you can eat lots of easily obtainable mussels and crabs, and compared to the forest where there's all, and you can, if a predator like a tiger or a lion arrives, you jump in the water, and if a shark arrives, you jump out of the water. So, the beach is like our natural habitat in the Stone Age. And so we're sort of like semi-aquatic chimpanzees, which is why we look so different to the other animals, and why we think, we're not animals, we're humans. In other words, we appear to be semi-aquatic chimpanzees. Others don't believe in that and believe that we obtained all these features simply by running around on the grasslands. And you think, well, no other animal that runs along on the ground on the grassland ended up with these features that are perfectly adapted for swimming. And so if you can have humans as semi-aquatic chimpanzees, maybe there was at one time fully aquatic chimpanzees, though of course there's no physical evidence for that. There's only a few odd sightings. But as we know, the world has been inhabited by fabulous animals, and you only have to look at documentaries and look at books and stuff on dinosaurs and prehistoric mammals and everything, up until very recently, mammoths and everything, giant sloths, everything imaginable. And so semi-aquatic chimpanzees can certainly fit in with everything from giant sloths to all the other astounding animals that cover the surface of the planet.
I think if I could choose any cryptid to be real, it would be a mermaid. If I could, what one's real, physically real? Mermaid. But speaking of other ones I'm interested in, I'm always fascinated with Bigfoot and Sasquatch and the Yeti and Australia's versions. Now, I know you've had some of your own sightings. Your book, by the way, is loaded with sightings and reports. It's so thorough. Again, people should check it out. We'll tell them how they can at the end of the episode. But can you tell us some of your own reports? I think your first hairy man report was in Papua New Guinea again, I think, right?
Yeah, yes. Well, the first as soon as I left high school, I was working in a pet shop, and then I got jobs in a national park. I was a founding member of the conservation movement. I was a member of the Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, a founding member, etc. And I was working in the national parks up at Lamington. And if any of our American listeners come over to Australia, they're the most fantastic places in Australia. A place called the Gold Coast in northern New South Wales, because of the fabulous mountains behind, which is a 20 million year old volcanic caldera. With prehistoric rainforest, with trees forests that have survived from the age of the dinosaurs, and there's fabulous. It's all protected in wonderful national parks. And I was a ranger, really a ganger. This is 1971. We're just called gangers. We work gangs basically, but we were rangers. And up in Lamington National Park, O'Reilly's. And one night something started thumping the side of the rangers' quarters, and the one of the rangers went to the door, saying, "Oh, what is it? What is it? Do you need help or something?" and then opened the door and there was no one there. And then next thing, we could hear that something was under the house. So it was open under the house. The house is old, little timber house, 3-bedroom and an office and one large room, fuel stove. We had no electricity. We had a little electric light. We had one electric cable or electric line coming to the house, but basically it was very primitive, very remote, surrounded by wilderness, hours of driving to get there through undisturbed wilderness at an elevation of about 3,000 feet, I think it is, or 1,000 meters, something like that, or 800 meters or something. And so the house was built on the edge of the rainforest, and the house sloped down at the back. So there was a second story underneath. There was nothing in it, and that's where we kept our tools. And there was no light. We had no outside lights, and it was pitch black. And then whatever it was disappeared. And then the next day we went down. We found all the tools lying on the ground. We had to throw them back under the house. And then I went down to the wood heaps to get some wood because we wanted hot water. We had big piles of timber. We had to burn timber to get a hot water. We had a fuel stove, which was a big cast iron stove, and the wood pile. We had a huge wood pile that was measured about 6-7 feet long and a couple of 6 foot high, say, and 3 foot wide, and around about 8 big stakes of timber about 6 feet long or more that we'd sledgehammered into the ground to contain this whole wood pile. And something had pulled all the stakes of wood out of the ground, which is a physical impossibility, and thrown all the wood around. And when I asked the O'Reillys, they said, "Oh yeah, there's an animal we've never been able to identify." And Bernard O'Reilly writes in his book Green Mountains, which is the name of the area, that something used to follow him along the tracks in the daytime. And you'd go back looking to see what it was and never found what they were, but something would also roar or scream at them. No, they never identified it. So nothing then happened. I never found any sign of anything, and was put down as being one of the mountain bunyips. And then when I was in New Guinea, up at very high altitudes, I was working with a group of ornithologists. I was just a volunteer. They all had grants. They're all from America. I was the only Australian. This is 73, 74. And I was just helping out and paying my own way. But I just wanted to help out and also to watch the birds of paradise and all the fabulous animals, spotlighting at night and identifying everything. We had entomologists and botanists and everyone. And when we're in this one locality at high altitude on several occasions, we had these incredible bellowing roars come from the forest. And the largest animals there are cassowaries, which are giant flightless birds with horns on their heads, and tree kangaroos, and cuscusses, which are big possums, very distantly related to your American Virginia opossums, but look quite different, and also introduced wild pigs, but nothing that could make these sounds. And it sounded very primate-like. It sounded more like the call of a primate. I used to follow it through the forest. I'd walk a kilometre or two through the primary undisturbed rainforest. In undisturbed rainforest, you can walk around on the ground because there's a heavy tree cover, and on the ground, nothing but leaf litter and ferns and things like this, small shrubs scattered around. And there's quite a few large flightless giant pigeons, giant crowned, Victoria crowned pigeons that are the size of turkeys with a big crest on their heads with white spots, so that when they walk, they look like they've got a halo of stars on their head. Wow. And other species and megapodes, brush turkeys, etc. So I could never find out what gave these calls. We didn't hear them very often, very rarely. And then one time I was walking along a track. It was a logging track that had been put in, but no logging had occurred. And I saw a person come out through the forest onto the track in front of me, like a New Guinean, in that he was completely dark-skinned, not wearing any clothes. But I was too far away. I was probably about 600 feet from him or something or other. I had my binoculars with me, but I immediately took it was a person, and definitely was a person. But unlike the New Guineans, they all wear some forms of clothing. In those days, they were traditionally dressed in. They create their own clothing out of bush strings. They always have bush string bags. They always have their bows and arrows. They always have an axe, a stone axe, or a steel axe, and they're always in groups. And they don't wander through the rainforest. They follow tracks because they're hunting. And so, it's easier to hunt along the track, say birds of paradise or other species or pigs or cassowaries or whatever. But this individual crossed the track, walked backwards and forwards, was looking down onto an ornithologist who was in a hide. And I was thinking, it's someone to come. Because we're in a very remote area where there was no people. So, I thought maybe my colleague had organised for someone to join us because this individual then went down. So, I had a good view of this individual for, a couple of minutes or something or other, trying to work out who is this. I had my binoculars, but I didn't before I could even think of putting the binoculars, because I just thought it was a person, but I couldn't understand why he wasn't carrying anything, why he was by himself. Why did he come out of the forest and cross the track? And he never looked up the track, so he never noticed me. And then he went down as if he was heading down to see the ornithologist. And when I got to the area, got a perfect clear view, looking slightly downhill. I said, who was your friend? Who was that person? And he said, no, what? There's been nobody about. I haven't seen anybody. No, there hasn't been anybody. So whether that was the animal or the species or whatever that was calling, but we do know that the New Guineans and the Aboriginal people, they have a lot of about 4 or 5% DNA from this wonderful new species that we now call the Denisovan, which is a species of human, unrelated, distantly related to humans, but not closely related to humans. That's only known from a finger bone and some teeth, and I think also some more material maybe from the Himalayas. And they got a DNA analysis, and they said it was related to Neanderthals, distantly, but it was more ancient than Neanderthals, and in fact, it was one of the candidates possibly for the Yeti. And so it was lived in northern hemisphere, but it came down all the way to Australia, New Guinea, for people to interbreed with them. But when we talk about interbreeding, I mean, it mightn't have been a romantic situation. It might have been who knows what went on during the Stone Age. It's bad enough today, much less the Stone Age. And so maybe this was the surviving Denisovans. These another species of human that are wandering around in the high altitudes, way above where the New Guineans themselves live. It was just another anomaly. I saw that individual cross, and I got no evidence that it was real, or that I'm not making it up. But I was really surprised, and and it was only afterwards I began to think about it. But that person wasn't carrying anything. Nobody. Nobody moves through high altitude rainforest not having anything in their hands, and how could somebody be walking up there and it was high altitude Antarctic beach and Podocarpus rainforest and clinky pine so that was. And then when I got back to Australia in 1975, I was near Springbrook. And as usual, I was exploring by myself. I was always exploring the forest by myself, and I just identifying the plants and animals. That was always what I always did. It was if I had free time, I was always off in the bush bird watching and identifying the plants and animals. And something roared at me with a powerful roaring voice. that was as loud as a lion, but was nothing like a lion or any big cat. It was some other kind of animal altogether. And then also in about 1969, I had a very close view of what may have been the marsupial lion, Thylacines carnifex. This amazing animal crossed the road directly in front of me at about 11 o'clock at night. This is on the road between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, when it was all forest and farms. Now it's all factories and civilization.
Right.
It was 69 though, and I was only a young fella with my first car driving at night, and this amazing animal crossed the road about the size of a leopard, with a big solid head that reminded me of a mastiff dog. And then the body came out covered in brindled hair, and then it had a long fluffy tail with dark bands on the tail, and the hind, and it wasn't worried, and there was virtually no traffic in those days, and I had to put the brake on so I didn't hit it, and so I was right up to it, and had the lights on full beam, and it was unconcerned, and it just crossed the road directly in front of me, and the hind legs moved like a marsupial. You could see it was a marsupial, carnivorous marsupial, as big as a leopard, but a big head, not small head like a leopard, say. It had a big solid head, and the hindquarters moved like our brush-tailed possums, and the marsupial lion. It's only known from fossils dating the latest about 38,000 years ago. And it was a pouched carnivorous animal. It wasn't related to the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger. It's related to possums, and sure enough, it walked like a possum. And there's been a great number of reports of these, but all over the east coast of Australia, but particularly in Queensland. And it was mentioned in early scientific books as a true species. They're still trying to get a specimen, and it was known as the marsupial cat or marsupial tiger, because most individuals had distinct bands and a large head, and there's been a great many reports of that over the years, still coming in from undisturbed rainforest, and just like the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger reports, and also the Yowies. Virtually all of these animals are carnivores. The Yowie might be more omnivorous, but and as we know, with any big, powerful animal, predators in particular, they have big territories, and so like the Siberian tiger are hundreds of square kilometres of territory, and our carnivorous marsupials, like the spotted-tailed tiger cat or tiger quoll, which doesn't look anything like a cat. It looks more like a sort of a big ferret or a marten or a mongoose or something. It's a native pouched marsupial. Some individuals in poorer territory have a range, they say, of about 100 square kilometres. So with all of these predators, need, for one tiger, you might need 1,000 deer or antelope or something or other. And they have, all these predatory animals have large territories. And so if there are still marsupial lions and marsupial tigers or thylacines, etc., they'll be very hard to encounter because they're all ambush predators. So they know their entire environment, they know their territory, and the chance of you, and if they have a huge territory like 100 square kilometres, the chance of you ever encountering one is remote. And most of these reports and I've received a great many from during 27 years of radio shows, wildlife identification. So people would phone in to get wildlife identified, and 99% of them were always animals easily identified. But occasionally I'd get a report that couldn't be identified, but always fitted into these other group of animals that I was getting reports of, and that other researchers have been getting reports in and studying. And nearly all of these reports, the farmers in particular and foresters, national park rangers or bush regenerators, they generally only ever encounter one of these animals once in their life. even though they've been on these farms for years. Sometimes they'll get 2 or 3 reports over a 30-year period. And we also get Black Panther-like animals, which could be just a black phase of the marsupial lion, or it could be something else altogether, or they could be exotic animals. I had a report by a big cat specialist who's been all over the world studying big cats, and he saw a black panther in Victoria in daylight right beside his car, and he went to the police and told them, "Oh, black panthers escaped," and the police said, "Oh, we get reports of them all the time. We don't. What do you think? What can we do about it?"
It's interesting that you mentioned how things like a potential thylacine would have such a great range as its natural predatory kind of movements, because I know here in America, things like cougars or mountain lions or whatever you want to call it, they have various names. It's the same animal. They have great large ranges. Like you might get one passing through literally the Walmart parking lot 30 minutes from where I live had a cougar go through it, but it doesn't live there. It ranges. Do you know what I mean? It's got an incredible throw. So I've always thought of, I said before, my favorite cryptid, if it was real, would be a mermaid, probably followed closely by, I'd like a Bigfoot to be true. But I think the most likely of almost every cryptid I've ever, hear about today, I do suspect that there really are thylacines still on, perhaps in Tasmania and also in mainland Australia. Are you still getting reports today on your radio show about thylacines?
See, what generally happens, I only receive reports if a report comes in and the news services take it up, and then I'll be flooded with reports, and then they'll go quiet again, because most people, and because everyone that sees these animals, they generally say, "Oh, you're the only person I've really talked to about these animals, because everyone else laughs at me." And as you know, if you saw something mysterious like a Bigfoot, and you go, "Oh my God, I saw a Bigfoot in the back garden last night," or something or other, everyone, almost certainly everyone's going to laugh at you, because it's not something that commonly happens, and they're positive you're making it up. And the same thing with thylacines. Yeah, there's been reports non-stop. It's interesting that in Tasmania, the British had set up a settlement at Hobart, and it was 4 years before they saw their first thylacine, which they caught in a trap. And then they were very rarely ever seen or trapped. And when one was trapped, but mainly by fur trappers, the whole island was covered, and it's a huge island. It's about 68,000 square meters, or am I talking about square kilometers or something? But yes. 68,000 square kilometres, I think it is. Tasmania, about 1/3 of it is so wild, it's complete wilderness. A majority of the island's covered in forest, and so I myself don't receive many reports because I'm not in Tasmania, but there's some wonderful Facebook sites, the Thylacine Awareness Group. In particular, I know, because Neil Waters has been able to obtain some trail camera footage with images that look, very, very much like a thylacine, though experts looking at it say no, it's more likely a wallaby or something, because especially if you're a biologist, you're forced to take a sort of skeptical opinion,
right?
So I would estimate that if thylacines still exist, and what you've got to remember, that they were made out to be sheep killers, and a bounty was put on their heads, and people only began to obtain trap specimens of them, and they were exhibited in zoos all over the world, including Washington and London and in Europe and in all the Australian zoos, or most of them, and people were keeping them as pets. They're really marsupial dogs, and they were exhibited in dog shows, and you could buy if you're interested, buy a marsupial dog, also known as marsupial hyena or marsupial wolf, or Tasmanian tiger, because they've got a few stripes on their back, 10 or 12 or 15, 20 stripes. And they stand up like a kangaroo, and they were kept in captivity, and then they were hit by a disease, a mange-like disease, because the Australian marsupials are very much susceptible to diseases, as all animals are. Like the First Nation people, both in Australia and North America, was devastated by the smallpox pig virus that they had no immunity to, and so the thylacines suddenly began to decline in the beginning of the 20th century. Though even before then they were rarely seen. And remember that the studies of their jaws show that they've got slender jaws, and they've got no strength in their jaws. The Tasmanian tigers had been mixed up in many people's minds with Tasmanian devils, and have very powerful jaws, and they crunch through bones. But researchers studying the skulls of thylacines have stated that they got very slender bones, that they couldn't grab an animal as big as a sheep, and that they only feed on little animals like bush rats and stuff, even though they're, say, large dog-sized or medium dog-sized. But I've picked up close to 100 reports of them over the last 30 years in southeastern Queensland, northeastern New South Wales in particular, going back to the 1960s, when a logger or forestry worker had two really close views of one crossing the road. And then I had a fantastic report, one of my earliest reports from about 25, 30 years ago, where a group of banana workers on a banana plantation in northern New South Wales, Crabs Creek, had, and the chap that told me was a school teacher who was taking his school holidays, getting a bit of extra pay, working as a banana. and as they were walking back down the slope, and there was a group of them, the owner's German Shepherd dog began to growl at a partly collapsed, overgrown with vines banana packing shed. And he thought it was probably a feral cat, and he said, get him, go, get him. And the dog charged into the shed, and then immediately came backing out, and they were shocked to see this huge animal with his enormous wide jaws that was virtually almost as big as the German Shepherd dog, and it was giving forth with these really weird sounds, and not barks or meows or anything. It definitely wasn't a dog or a cat, and it had stripes on its back. And the owner said, "Oh my God, it's a monster!" And he grabbed a stone and threw at it. And it suddenly realised there was a group of people standing there, and it ran uphill, and they all chased it uphill. And it ran into a big hollow log, and they were looking at it in the hollow log and going, "Oh, I'll have to bring a rifle back tomorrow. We can't have a monster living on the property." And because a lot of people, when they see one of these thylacines, they think, "Oh, someone's bred a dog with a kangaroo," because that's what they resemble. They can run like a dog and jump like a kangaroo. They've got big hindquarters and stripes on the back. So then the next day they went up, but of course it was gone, and they never saw it again. And so I received many reports, and one was from a vet nurse at Suffolk Park in Byron Bay, near the edge of her the property she owned or rented or whatever, was against the national park. And at 6 a.m, she heard this strange sound. It sounded like a brush-tailed possum, which goes sort of a strange sort of a coughing sound, which is exactly what a thylacine makes. And so she went out, and then she got, "Oh my God, there's a dog attacking a cat." And she rushed up to it, trying to shoo it away from a cat. And so she's only within a metre of this animal. And then she realised, "Oh my God, it's not a dog." And she's a vet. As you know, dogs had no dog-like characteristics, whatever it was. She said, no doubt about it. It was a thylacine, a female thylacine. And she watched it for 5 minutes from 1 to 2 or 3 metres away before it turned around and disappeared back into the bush. And so they're unaggressive animals. And I haven't had any recent reports of them. But if one was to come in and the newspapers took it up, I'd suddenly receive a whole bunch of reports, because people always don't bother. And there's a thylacine behind me. If I could just move out of the way. There it is. That's a thylacine behind me there.
Yes.
And that comes from the that's a tea towel from the federal government's Parliament House in the ACT Canberra. I got that, the thylacine. So it's a well-loved animal by Australians and some scientists, and say, oh, all these reports of thylacines that are received, it's because people feel guilty about, you know, how we hunted them to extinction. Though I think there's probably something like 300 individuals living in Tasmania, maybe only 150 or something, but just enough to be reproducing. And the thing with marsupials, unlike placentals, unlike animals like ourselves, the Australian marsupials have adapted to an incredibly resource-poor, nutrient-poor environment, because when the ice ages swept across the world, Australia was too far north from Antarctica to be affected. So while the rest of the world was, particularly North America and Eurasia, of course, was covered by these huge ice sheets that came and went over 17 million years, ground all the rock into really fertile soil and created lakes everywhere. And that's why 360 million people can say live in the United States alone, because you've got such rich soils. And that's why the United States is such a powerful country, because you can't be powerful unless you have an enormous amount of agriculture to support the population and then be able to afford industries and everything. But Australia is the exact opposite. We never had glaciation, so we've got all kinds of spectacular rock formations, a bit like Western United States. We've got fabulous minerals, so the Australians are a very wealthy nation because of all the minerals that we've got. But our country is so nutrient poor, it's very poor in phosphorus. Well, many of the native plants, if you fertilize them, it would kill them. And the animals are adapted to that environment as well. So animals like koalas and stuff, they might only produce one young every couple of years, and the koalas, for instance, feed on deadly poisonous eucalyptus leaves with very low nutrients. The animals are all adapted to a very nutrient poor environment, and so they've developed all kinds of adaptations so that they don't waste energy. So that, koalas spend most of the day asleep, and people think, I must be drunk on gum leaves or something, but they're conserving energy. And thylacines and marsupial lions, if they exist, all of these animals are well adapted to very nutrient poor environments, so they're naturally inactive. They spend most of their time asleep. And as well as that, remember, all these Australian animals have coexisted with First Nation people who are the most wonderful conservationists and protected the environment very carefully, because they relied on it for their survival. And so all of these animals, like thylacines, that live right across Australia and New Guinea, as well as Tasmania, they knew humans well, and thylacines have a very powerful sense of smell. And when they were kept as pets, they'd probably be tied up. And when the thylacine got very restless, the owners, the farmers, would know, we better put the billy on, because we're going to have visitors. Looks like the neighbours are on their way over. And 20 minutes later, the neighbours would arrive, on their horse and cart or something, and so the thylacines coexisted with Indigenous, First Nation, Aboriginal people for thousands upon thousands of years, and these people, just like Indigenous people over the world, were the greatest hunters imaginable. You can imagine, they knew the environment, they survived hunting and gathering. They also had their own farming techniques as well. The First Nation Australians were the earliest grain farmers, and they've got grinding bowls that go back 30,000 years. So they were farming native grains for 20,000 years before Westerners and Asians began to do that. Eurasians began to do that, or North American indigenous people, or South American indigenous people for that matter. So, and so these animals are naturally pre-adapted to leaving a locality as soon as they can scent. And they don't know what a human is, but they know a human is a big animal, and a big nasty animal as well. And it's the same thing with Yowies and Bigfoot. You know, these animals aren't dangerous because they've lived with us for vast periods of time. And if you're going to look at the perspective from the Yowie or the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch or whatever, you know, they must live in families at least, and the parent, they must have some form of communication. And from what I've heard and read, you know, they have quite a complex language, a sort of a chattering sort of a language. And all animals have, particularly the primates, have deep, really complex languages that we just think of as noises or calls, but there's all kinds of intonations. It's the same thing. If you didn't speak English, you know, I'd be just babbling away unintelligibly if you couldn't understand the particular language coming out of my throat. And so a Yowie or a Bigfoot or whatever, they would know their whatever they call themselves. Say they call themselves Sasquatch, who knows? And then in North America, and they would know that. They'd tell the young ones, now be careful because the neighbouring Sasquatch live on the next mountain range. And if you go wandering over there, the father Sasquatch will give you a good beating, you know, and chase you out of his habitat. And then the most dangerous are the little bloody hairless Sasquatch that live on the flats. They're the most dangerous of all because there's huge numbers of them, and they're real clever. For a start, they can live with all kinds of big ferocious animals like cattle and horses, and they can control them. You can imagine. I'd see a person jump on top of a big animal like a horse and ride off with it, and you'd think, oh my God, I better be careful because one of those little Yowies or little Sasquatch, if I got too close, they might jump on me and ride me away. Who knows? And also they've got strange things, you know, which are cars, would be like big rocks or something that move quickly, and they can make bright lights somehow. And so Bigfoot or Yowies or Sasquatch or any of these animals would be terrified of people, and you don't attack them because they also know that, say, they encounter a person and that person runs away. Are they thinking, oh, that person's frightened of me? Or would they be thinking, uh-oh, that person might be running off to get in reinforcements and suddenly lots of them will arrive and there's only one of me and there's lots of them. I know lots of them live further away on the flats there. And who knows when they could turn up. I'm going to sneak away as carefully as possible. And in a recent encounter we had, a research of Rod Benfield, and I went and investigated a locality with a gentleman who was a gold prospector in the Upper Clarence River, and he had an interesting encounter where he heard something heavy running around, and he went out with his torch to see what kind of an animal it was, thinking it was just a cow or a kangaroo or something, and he was on a slight slope. And he shone his torch, and he was absolutely shocked to see this big man right in front of him at head height, even though it was down slope. And it was definitely, it looked like a man, but with no clothes on. And he naturally took it to be another camper. He was in a cabin, and this fellow was obviously a camper. And he's shining the light on him and thinking, oh, my God, but because he didn't believe in Yowies, like most people don't. You know, it's a myth, an indigenous myth to scare children or something, like the bunyip. And he realised, oh my God, this is a giant, hairy, bloody man-like thing, and it opened its mouth and snarled at him.
Gosh.
And he's somewhere between 1 and 3 meters from it, so face to face, and he's just shining the torch right on his face. And he said, and it had huge human-like teeth, but they were sort of stained, like it didn't clean its teeth. And then he thought, oh my God, this thing could just tear me to pieces. It's so huge and muscular. And then it immediately turned around and ran like mad down slope. And then it ran across the shallow river, climbed up the cliff on the other side, and then threw a huge boulder down onto the river as if to say, don't you chase me. And that shows you, see, that's what generally happens. You have a face-to-face encounter with a Yowie, and the same thing probably with a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. They seem to be very similar animals. They're generally not aggressive. And another wonderful encounter we had that took place is the most well-known and oldest Yowie investigation Facebook site called Australian Yowie Researcher, Yowie hunters. In Australia, we're not a nation of hunters. We don't own guns except for a few farmers shooting feral animals. He gave me this report that was reported to him by a gentleman, and this is during a couple of years ago during the a pandemic when people weren't allowed to travel more than 5 kilometres. Well, because a COVID-19 pandemic, everyone was forced to stay indoors, like going on all over the world. Then he went for a walk at a nearby national park where he grew up in the Gap west of Brisbane, in southeast Queensland, and he pulled up at the car park, and he knows there was no other cars there, but you're allowed to travel at a short distance for exercise. And then so off he said normally it'd be lots of people all going out for a walk or a run through the national park. And so off he went, I think it was a few kilometres for a run through and he was in a remote part of it, and he could hear rocks being thrown, and he thought, there's certainly some people out here. There must be kids, but there's no homes nearby. But he thought that's strange. And once again, he didn't believe that Yowies existed for a second, as most city dwellers in particular, or most people don't. And so he thought, I'd go and have a look and see who's throwing rocks. And so he crept up along this smaller creek that crossed the track, and poked his head out of the vegetation, and I think from something like 30 metres away. He was amazed to see that there was an animal covered in hair that looked just like a person, and I think it had his back to him, and it was picking up rocks and throwing them down, smallish rocks, I think, or maybe rocks the size of a football perhaps, and then it was looking around, and it suddenly noticed him, and it gave a bizarre sort of sound, and he's sort of thinking, oh my God, what was one of these Yowies? And it was about the same size as him. And then immediately he discovered it was, oh no, this was a young one, because the father then stood up, and it was like a giant gorilla-like thing. And it roared at him. And, of course, he just turned around and ran for his life.
Gosh.
And I pointed out to him when I was having a conversation with him, now, you could have probably run at it, and it would run away probably. Because just imagine if it was really dangerous, and there are reports that people have gone missing in the wilderness, and they theoretically they could be dangerous. But in this instance, for instance, if it had attacked him and torn him to pieces, what would have happened? The family would have said, Dad hasn't come home. They'd call the police. They'd say, he usually goes for a run in the national park. Maybe he's had a fall. The police would go to the national park, see his car. The police and the rangers would start emergency services personnel would go searching, and then they'd suddenly find his body torn to pieces. And what would that tell them? He had encountered something awfully big. And these Yowies, and same thing with Bigfoot and Sasquatch and Yetis perhaps, or whatever, they're intelligent. They know you do not touch anything to do with people. You don't go and kill them and eat them or anything like that. Because if they were dangerous, we'd know all about them. Like we know we don't. Just recently we had someone else taken by a shark. We have great white sharks swimming around the southern coastlines of Australia, And we know every now and then someone gets taken, and just find a surfboard drifting by itself and a couple of bites out of it or something. There's something dangerous there, and you go, there's something dangerous there. And that's how these Yowies. So I myself don't really think they're supernatural, because it's sort of more likely that they're just flesh and blood like we are, and that they're simply very cryptic and very able to hide themselves away from people, and know that they can't afford to be seen, and they certainly can't afford to harm anybody, but they will roar at you or run at you, so they'll scare you off like any animal will, like gorillas do. We used to believe that gorillas were dangerous animals that tear you to pieces if you encountered one, and then we discovered they're gentle vegetarians, and that all they do would be they might charge at you and roar at you, but then they run away, which is exactly what Yowies do, and Sasquatch, I believe. That's just some of the many reports that have come in, and I'm relatively inactive in researching these things compared to other researchers in Australia. There's about 25 different Facebook sites in Australia, all involved in one form or another of cryptozoology, a lot of Yowie ones. And if watchers of this interview are interested, they can go online and have a look at those Facebook groups, and of course they're all serious researchers. They might disagree occasionally about the way they're investigating or their methods or whatever, but generally all they can do is wander around in the bush and look for evidence and listen, just the same way your Bigfoot investigators operate in the same way. And then of course Rex and Heather Gilroy, really the grandparents, as it were, of cryptozoology in Australia. I mean, I only discovered, but I had actually had this encounter when I was a national park ranger. I've had more recent encounters right near where I live, and my daughter has as well, and a partner, one of our daughters, and with both the big Yowies, which stand about 7 to 8 feet or larger in size. They can be both slim or they can be very solidly built. Usually they have 5 toes. But the other interesting thing, the Yowie footprints have been studied by museum personnel, which have 3 toes, and Tony Healy and Paul Cropper in their book, The Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot. That's their Tony Healy and Paul Cropper's original book, published a few years ago, 2006, I think. That's their earliest book, Out of the Shadows, and they've done an enormous amount of investigation, as have a lot of other researchers since. But and one of their investigations took place in the Northern Territory, where I think it was a mango farmer was hearing all kinds of weird screams and roars and what have you, and went down to the wife went down to have a look with a torch, and saw this big hairy animal, generally described as a Yowie, big hairy animal, pulling at a barbed wire fence, like for no particular reason, and giving all these strange sounds, and it had defecated, so there was found a huge feces lying on the ground. I can't remember, I think it ran off, and she had no idea what kind of an animal this was, but she alerted the museum, the Northern Territory Museum, and they went down, and his footprints were very clear, and it was 3-toed, and they took made plaster casts of the footprints, and I suppose they took the feces away. I'm not quite sure of that. But interestingly enough, as I said earlier, these animals were reported again and again in newspapers, in mainly regional newspapers, but also in the big city newspapers. And in 1912, a gentleman wrote to the Sun newspaper in Sydney after a surveyor and his team had an encounter with a Yowie that was called an anthropoid. And interesting enough, these Yowies, there could be more than one species. We don't know what we're operating with. This one that it came up to the fire and on 2 legs, and then ran away on 4 legs after sort of roaring at them and beating its chest. They all got a close look at this animal, and he reported it to the newspaper, and that was first illustration of a Yowie, 1912, in the Sun newspaper in Sydney. And so this person that lived in a gentleman that lived in the Hawkesbury River Valley, or Hawkesbury River. It's an incredible sandstone river system with sandstone escarpments, high cliffs, and all rugged bushlands. There's never been settled. It's all national park now because it's very infertile soils covered in woodland. And he wrote that there's been many encounters with this big animal that resembles a gorilla, and that on at least 3 encounters it was very plainly observed that the female had a pouch on a belly just like a kangaroo, with a young one that would look like a little black person in the pouch. And so he said this shows that we actually have a marsupial man, and we know from fossil evidence from New Guinea, which was joined to Australia until recently, there was an animal that lived there. About the fossils, I think, about 9,000 years old. It's called the mountain diprotodontid Holotherium thomasettii, and so it was related to koalas. And so it was like a huge koala, and is known as the marsupial panda, or the marsupial gorilla, or the marsupial bear. And last century, down to the southwest of Sydney, a gentleman with his horse and cart encountered an animal that he described as a hairy man that came out onto the road with its arms raised, and he hit it on the head with his whip, and then grabbed the rock and killed it. And then he threw it into the back of his wagon, and he brought it to town and exhibited it in front of his cordial factory. And then journalists and police had a look at it, and they described it as having it was stood 6 or 7 foot tall, covered in hair, and had a face they described as looking something like a bear. And so maybe we have a marsupial. Maybe these Holotherium thomasettii inhabited Australia as well, and so we've got a marsupial ape living in Australia. That would be fascinating. It would be wonderful to find that there's a completely unknown. Well, whatever the Yowie is completely unknown. But as well as that, we've got these little hairy men, little hairy people. Locally, they're known as Nimbinjis here, otherwise known as Junjuddies, and they seem to resemble something like a bipedal gibbon. And in fact, we had one on our roof because we live in the forest. And our partner, our younger daughter's partner, Matteo, he got a close look at it. It jumped up onto the roof at night. Now, we've been here close to 25 years and I've never seen anything. Though I did find amazing footprints once, or look like children's footprints in the mud at the bottom of the property. And the indigenous people know, we've always known them. They've always been here, along with the bigger Yowies. There's definitely, they say there's 2 species, and it very closely resembles that species of fossil human Homo floresiensis found on the island of Flores in southern Indonesia, directly north of Australia. And there was a book recently published by an anthropologist or zoologist who was studying the Floresian native people, and they talk about a little hairy people that live in the forest, and they found the actual skeletons, but the skeletons were thousands of years old, And then, of course, we know in Sumatra, orang pendek, the little gibbon-like or something terrestrial orangutan, some people think it is. It's been seen even by zoologists trying to research it. Once again, very rare and very cryptic, and it looks like a little hairy person, basically, maybe a small species of terrestrial orangutan. But so maybe they're all the same animals, or maybe they're all related to one another. But remember, Australia is vast, and in the most astounding animals that Rex and Heather Gilroy obtained, and I talked about them before, they had this wonderful museum. I first visited their museum in the early 1970s, and then I visited them again in 1981, and he had a wonderful cryptozoological museum up in the Blue Mountains, and Rex and Heather and I talked at many conferences together, particularly the last 3 ones that Jack Tessier set up in Newcastle, Australian Cryptological Research Organisation, and he was one of the people that obtained the most amount of reports, because he had the actual cryptozoological museum set up, and so people would come and talk to him and ask them, I saw this and I saw that. Now, you don't know if people are trying to hoax you, but very few people are trying to go to hoax you for something if there's no money involved. I mean, it's a waste of time. And if you tell people, I saw fairies in the bottom of the garden or whatever, no one's going to believe you. But so they received around about 36 reports of a carnosaur, surviving carnosaur. So in other words, something like a T-Rex being reported again and again throughout Australia. And they published this book, Burrenjaw. So Burrenjaw, The Search for Australia's Living Tyrannosaurus.
Wow.
And this animal, now you'd think, no, well, there's no chance of that. That's ridiculous, because the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago when that asteroid impacted the northern hemisphere and wiped out everything around the world, except Gondwana was the furthest away from the impact, the South Pole. And the only animals and plants that survived pretty much were from the southern South American, Gondwana and Antarctic Australian locality, and then they spread back to the rest of the world over millions of years, so that around about 60 million years, the forest was once again covered by forests. The planet was covered by forests and all kinds of the ancestors of modern mammals and birds and everything. But the only place on Earth that survived, that's the most survived that impact was Australia. And that's why Australia has all kinds of fabulously ancient animals. We have lungfish that have remained unchanged for something like 350, 400 million years, only live in 2 freshwater rivers in southeast Queensland, and they've survived all that time. And we have platypus, which are monotremes, egg-laying mammals, and the egg-laying mammals ruled the world for 70 million years before the dinosaurs took off, and then ruled the world for the next 136 million years. And they've been 66 million years extinct. But the platypus and the echidnas are still here. And Australia's full of all kinds of ancient plants. We even discovered the Wallamai pine about 20, 30 years ago, which is only known from fossils about 150 million years old, and they found 40 trees of it in one gorge, only a couple of 100 kilometres or miles less than that from Sydney, in the Wallamai wilderness. This prehistoric dinosaur food tree still growing there, and so you'd think, there's no chance of something like they're not true T-Rexes anyway, because that's purely an animal that lived in the northern hemisphere. But there were a whole array of carnosaurs that lived in the southern hemisphere, and all those fabulous giant dinosaurs, titanosaurs and what have you, found in South America. We're also finding the remains of them in Australia, because it was all joined together as one continent. And so these are, these reports, you'd think, oh, there's no chance. I think there's a greater possibility of something existing if there's correlating evidence. Like if only reports all come from one research, you go, oh, that's a bit suspicious, even though that research has been studying them for a long time. And so I was astounded on 2 occasions when I received reports of the same animal. And one report I received about at least 25 years ago now, from a woman who lived in North Queensland for most of her life and worked as a station cook with a husband at Chillagoe Station in the far North Queensland, Cape York Peninsula area. And she said that one day the stockmen, the cowboys, came riding in and said, oh, we saw the most shocking thing. We saw a giant bipedal reptile come out of a big lagoon in the river in a gorge, and they were, from memory, they were on the plateau, the flat plateau above this gorge, not very high, and of course they just took off for their life. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. And then only this year, Matteo, who's a wonderful artist and a tattoo artist, he was tattooing one of his clients down in Adelaide, I think it was, and he particularly loves to do tattoos of reptiles, snakes, and maybe dragons, and and he said, he mentioned that his favourite animal is the T-Rex, and this gentleman, the client, said, oh, I haven't told anybody, but I saw one. I saw a T-Rex. He said,
goodness me.
And it was from the same locality where this chap, where the Rex and Heather Gilroy had picked up reports and actually gone looking for it years ago and found footprints, and they made plaster casts of footprints. I mean, they could be of giant birds. We have emus, but we did have giant species of birds. Anyway, this is a 3-toed footprint. And he said he was from Coober Pedy, this area. He said he was, or in that general area. It's an opal mining area, and he said he was driving his big truck, coming back from a mine site, or a quarry site actually, and he was driving quietly along the road along a bush track, and he could hear a thumping sort of a sound coming up beside him. So he decided he'd turn off the engine and see what this noise was, because he was also thinking maybe there's something going wrong with the truck or something. It's like a tip truck that carries rock, and but this was just like just after work, like just in the very late afternoon. And so he turned off the engine, and so these, how high you are on a big truck, and he was watching, and he could hear this sound coming. It sounded like footsteps, and suddenly he realised he could see. And of course, most of our interior, although it's very arid, it's covered in trees, small trees and shrubs. And he said suddenly he realised there was a head that reminded him of a Tyrannosaurus Rex head from Jurassic Park, looking at him from the trees, only a few metres away. And it sort of gave him the shock of his life, and immediately started the engine and then drove off. And the Rex and Heather Gilroy had picked up the most astounding report. This is my favourite report of all. I mean, I regard it as almost an impossibility, but I just love this report. And it was a pair of opal miners, husband and wife, and their dog Toby, and they've been opal mining along this creek or searching for precious stones, prospecting. And they'd set up camp. They had the fire going. They'd cooked their dinner. They were relaxing, enjoying the beautiful full moon out in the desert, arid desert country, and it's all covered in shrubs, large shrubs. It's not like sand dune deserts. And suddenly their dog began to growl, and then it headed off into the bush directly in front of them, and it was growling and growling. And they're thinking, I wonder what it is, because the Australian bush is harmless. Like, you know, sure, there's some venomous snakes and the odd spider, but basically there's nothing out there dangerous that's going to harm you in any way. And and the next second, the dog came racing back into the camp and went straight under the car and hid under the car, whimpering. And then I was thinking, what on earth could have scared the dog? Like, we've only got kangaroos and emus, which aren't going to be active at night. I say kangaroos, or we've got wild camels and maybe wild pigs. Anyway, he said it must have been seen a camel or something. I'll go out and have a look. So he pushed his way into the bush, and he didn't bother putting on the torch because it was a full moon night and you could see perfectly clearly. And he wanted to sneak up on whatever this animal was that frightened the dog. And after he'd walked, I don't know, 100 meters or so, because they'd heard a bit of a sound of something moving about. And suddenly he realized that standing in front of him was this vast, dark mass. Some huge animal was standing in front of him. So he put his big bright flashlight or spotlight torch on, and was astounded to see an animal that looked just to him like a T-Rex out of a movie.
Goodness.
With a camel in it, not a camel, with a cow in its mouth.
What on earth?
And he's shining. It's only like 30, like 100 foot from him, 30 meters or something or other like that. He's walked right up to a T-Rex eating a cow and shining his torch on it, and then it drops the cow. And then it bends down and takes a big bite out of this wild cattle. We got a lot of wild cattle. It could have been a bull or something, and mightn't be a cow. And then it raised its head and it's chewing and swallowing, and he's standing there beside it, illuminating with the torch, in shock, like in absolute disbelief. And then suddenly it turns around and looks at him, because it suddenly notices a bright little light for some reason shining on it. And he turns the torch off, and then he runs back to the camp, and he can hear this thing. It sounds like it's following him now. And so he runs back to the camp, and he says to his wife, quick, get in the car, we're going, get in the car, we're going. And she's going, what, have you gone mad? What do you mean get in the car? I'm not getting out in the car. He said, quick, there's a huge animal coming. We've got to get in the car. And she's going, don't be ridiculous. I'm not going to get into the car. And then she suddenly realizes she can hear thump, 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 thump of vegetation being pushed aside.
It's like Jurassic Park.
Just like Jurassic Park. And so she runs. She goes, oh my God, there is something. And so they both jump into the car, and then they're going, where's the dog? Where's the dog? The dog had already jumped in as soon as they'd opened the doors. And then they started the engine. They looked back, and there was this thing like a T-Rex standing over the campfire, and off they drove. And then they came back the next day with other prospectors and opal miners, told them what they'd seen. And they went back, and sure enough, they found the carcass of a cow and big sort of footprints in the sand, but no sign of anything. And so so Rex and Heather Gilroy, they picked up, I think I looked through them, 36 reports all over sort of arid Australia, particularly, and the Indigenous people call it Burrinjaw, or in one locality. And I'm always happy to talk about other cryptological researchers' books, because it's just such fascinating subjects. And the Indigenous people and the drovers and other people that have encountered these people, truck drivers, these animals, they all say the same thing. Yet the animal is typical of any predator. Now you see a movie like Jurassic Park, and T-Rexes or any big carnivorous dinosaur, big brave animals that charge around attacking everything. But if you're a big predator, you don't know you're a big, powerful animal or whatever, because remember, you live with other big, powerful animals or whatever, including other individuals of your own species, say. So you've got to be careful. You don't want to get into a fight. It's just like people, you don't want to go down to the pub and get drunk and get into a fight with the locals or something or other. So you use a bit of care when you're dealing with other individuals in your habitat, because they can be as dangerous as you. And also predators need to save energy, and they have to be, everything has to be efficient. So what's it said? These surviving carnivorous dinosaurs live in very low numbers, scattered. They're purely nocturnal. They come out only at night. They never move far. They live in rocky gorges where they sleep during the day. They don't want to be disturbed. They're unaggressive. And then once it falls dark, then they start hunting, and they simply walk around short distances, standing in amongst the trees watching, because all predators are nearly all ambush predators. And that they always fed on kangaroos, say, but now they feed on camels and cattle and donkeys and all kinds of feral animals that have been run wild in huge numbers in Australia. Australia's the only place that has wild camels now, huge numbers of camels, and that they suddenly lurch out of the vegetation and have to be able to grab their prey within a few meters or they get outpaced.
As our viewer, the bearded one, said, what an incredible story. I can't think of a better story to close down the show. And Gary, it was fascinating talking to you. Your book, Australian Cryptozoology, is fascinating as well. I know I got it on Kindle. Is that the best place for people to find that book?
Yeah.
Amazon
Yeah,
Kindle?
so I'm actually been involved for the last year in rewriting it, because I self-published that years ago, and I mainly only sold it talking at a NEXUS conference lectures. A wonderful gentleman by the name of Duncan Rhodes has this a wonderful magazine called NEXUS. It's all kind of new science. I highly recommend it. There's American versions, English versions, and Australian versions, all kinds of fabulous stuff in the NEXUS magazines. And I used to, I've three or four times I've given talks on cryptozoology and other Australian mysteries. And I sold simply, I just get a few copies printed and sell them. But because I've got all kinds of fabulous information. I better finish off showing you a true Yowie footprint.
Oh, wow.
So look at that.
Did you cast that one, or?
No. So that was cast by Gary Maguire and Andre Clayton up at Springbrook in 1991, I think it was. And this is one of the few footprints, and it was eventually sent to me. It was sent to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, I believe his name is.
Jeff Meldrum. Jeff Meldrum,
and who examined it, and that was one of a series of prints that was found up on Springbrook. Springbrook's a wonderful place for Yowie encounters, but there's all kinds of, they're finding Yowie encounters everywhere. I've had reports of Yowies in small towns. The town of Lawrence, I had the local Baptist minister and his wife contact me, listening to me on the radio and telling me about this bizarre, that they always thought it was some intruder. And it was often around their house, climbing on their house. And at first they thought they were teenagers or something. They set up a security camera, and they got a photo of a gorilla-like thing, and they got rid of it because that couldn't be a possibility. It had to be people. And then they started phoning the police and complaining to the police, and the police would come out and say, "Oh yes, we've been getting these reports for years. It's a madman. This is a madman. He's been in the town for years. He's huge and hairy, and we've never been able to work out where he lives. He's never been seen in the daytime, and he's harmless. He just roams around at night and is in people's backyards." or front gardens or whatever.
Goodness gracious.
And then they would hear it regularly. And in the morning they'd come out and there'd be big muddy handprints on their door, on their front door. And they sort of blamed the neighbour. They thought maybe the neighbour was bloody trying to frighten them, and they'd glare at the neighbour. The neighbour would glare back, and I'd say, "Look, the neighbour thinks it's you roaming around at night." And then one day they were going to their church, and it's all sugarcane plantations, and they saw a big hairy man lying on the ground beside the road, and they go, "Oh my God, look at that mad! What kind of a mad cane farmer is that, covered in hair, sleeping beside the sugar cane?" And then they thought, "Oh, maybe why is he lying on the ground? It must be the farmer. He's been bitten by a snake or had a heart attack, and he's got some big coat on or something." So they drove back to find him, and then they drove past him. He was just off the road in a narrow thing, and they go, "There he is! Yes, he's there." And so they pulled around and went, and went there, and there was no sign of him. He'd gone. He stood up and wandered away. And so all kinds of bizarre accounts from all kinds of people.
We'll have to have you back to chat more about that. You've got, I mean, there's so many stories. You have, and again, your book, Australian Cryptozoology, has story after story after story.
Yeah, that's an original copy of it. But there'll be a new copy out soon.
Yeah, you should re-release it. The one I read was great, though. Like I said, you can get that on Amazon here in the US.
And this is the other astounding thing, also by Rex and Heather Gilroy, River of Monsters, the Hawkesbury River Monster in Myth and Reality. They picked up hundreds of reports, dozens of reports over the decades of plesiosaurs, long-necked plesiosaurs. And Tony Healy decided fairly recently he'd go and investigate, because it's hard to believe that there could be plesiosaurs living, Loch Ness monster type animals living in a big river near Sydney, a wilderness river.
I've boated along the Hawkesbury River. Maybe there was a plesiosaur next to me.
Yeah, and sure enough, he found reports as well of the odd report, at least, of a plesiosaur-like animal. And Bruce Champagne, an American cryptological researcher, particularly interested in sea serpents, said that the Australian locality has been a hotspot for sea serpent reports. And there's a fabulous report that I can't remember who first picked it up. One of our wonderful crypto researchers found it in the newspaper, a perfect description of a plesiosaur being seen down in Tasmania. This is like 100 years ago, and described the long neck, and he thought it was going to eat him. He rowed to shore, and he one of his friends showed him a picture drawing of a plesiosaur, what they believe they look like, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's the animal. Yeah, that's what I saw." And that was like over 100 years ago. Also seen by a lot of other experts, like people involved in sea rescues and everything like that, and even a wonderful photograph of a plesiosaur-like animal seen off Magnetic Island, seen by multiple people, and was photographed, and it appeared on our local on TV news, and they got an expert in, and they said, "Oh no, it can't be a plesiosaur. They've been extinct. That was simply a sunken boat that floated back to the surface and sailed around for a while before it sunk back under, because there's less chance of unknown animals in the ocean than there are of ships that can defy the effects of gravity and water pressure and will suddenly rise to the surface and swirl about and then go back under." But that was the official description of the explanation for an animal that somewhat resembled a plesiosaur being seen off Magnetic Island, the Great Barrier Reef. So, yeah, if you want to, Australia is the greatest nation on earth for cryptozoological mysteries. because we've got so much wilderness and a wonderful friendly population of caring people. It's a multinational country, and so if you have the possibility to come over and have a holiday and maybe even come over, here's why the shirt I'm wearing, I'll just show it to you, shows you I'm an Aussie. See, that's there's a koala, and occasionally, very rarely, on very rare occasions, we take people on a Yowie tour. It's called Vision Walks. You can look it up on the internet, and we take you to a spectacular locality where there's fabulous waterfalls inside caves, and big waterfalls and gigantic 2,000-year-old Antarctic beach trees, and we show you the actual localities where there was multiple encounters with Yowies, including by groups of school students with their teachers, and with a national park ranger, and encounters with ordinary people over the years. Rex and Heather Gilroy reckoned there was he had received something like 3,000 reports from the Blue Mountains. So right up and down the east coast of Australia, we have these spectacular mountain range, the Great Divide, and it's all sheer escarpments, and that seems to be the main habitat for these cryptozoological animals. And with that, I'll bid you goodbye.
Gary, how do people find out about that tour? Say they were coming to Australia and wanted to do one of your tours, or how do they find you generally? Like where should they go website?
Yeah, so it's called Vision Walks, and it's got an internet site, and they operate out of Byron Bay in the east coast of most easterly point in Australia, but we can pick people up in off the Gold Coast. We've done very few of these. The Vision Walks. A wonderful woman by the name of Wendy Bithell. She runs these tours. She does all kinds of wildlife tours. Before I retired, I used to often take these wildlife tours. We'd look at kangaroos and koalas and platypus, all the wonderful native Australian animals. Just on easy day drives. And one of these tours are up to look at these Yowies, localities where Yowies have seen. We've never encountered one, obviously. I did have one approach me over 20 minutes whacking two sticks together, and I only got glimpses of it. And then I followed it back into the forest, and I found what looked like its bed. Because they're not dangerous animals. Most people run and scream because they're not used to animals. They don't have anything to do with animals. So when they suddenly encounter a snake or a spider, it's the most frightening thing. Whereas if you're a biologist or a naturalist or anyone interested in animals, if you see something off in the bush, you're fascinated and you go off and have a closer look. And so I found what seemed to be its bed, but I never got a very good view of it. But Finding Bigfoot came over, and they filmed their Australian special, and they contacted me, and and I'm at the beginning of that Finding Bigfoot Australian special.
You're great in that. You're great in the Boogeymen Yowie episode as well.
Boogeymen, yeah.
Such a great episode.
Yeah. So
and MONSTERQUEST you're in as well, the goanna one.
Oh yeah, MONSTERQUEST. Yeah, I think that was one of the earlier ones, and we went looking for Yowies. That's where we did up at Katoomba in the Blue Mountains. That's probably still available to see. And yeah, I've done a few of them over the years with Canadian documentary makers, and I don't make anything out of this. I just enjoy doing it and meeting people and taking people for guiding them through the bush and looking, and of course the chance of encountering one of these animals. I spent most of my time in the bush. I've had 4 encounters with this animal that looked like a marsupial lion, including 3 encounters near my house here. And I've heard the Yowie roaring. Once heard it in 1978. It roared for 5 minutes, called about 100 times, not far from the house where I was living in on the edge of the rainforest. Then in 1996, I had an animal which might have been one of these Jungides or little hairy men or whatever, but something was barking quite close to me, once again for about 5 minutes with about 100 calls. It was going, arrow, 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 arrow. Like, I mean, what calls like that? It went on for like 5 minutes non-stop.
Goodness gracious.
But I never saw any sign of it. But interestingly enough, one of our close friends, her son, 12-year-old son, and the mother were walking up to our house in that same locality in Upper Maynarm, and they saw, it was one of our daughter's birthday parties, and as they walked up the steep track, they thought their car wouldn't make up this steep concrete driveway, which ran for like 3 kilometres. It's a very big remote property. We've always lived in a sort of wilderness situation as much as possible, and they thought they saw one of the children come running down from the party, and then they realised it was running just like a child, but it wasn't. But it wasn't running down the road. It was running through the bush beside the road, which was all kangaroo grass and a woodland, so sort of open, you could see clearly. And it ran up to them and suddenly saw them and stopped. And they said, you couldn't believe it. It was just like some sort of a chimpanzee on 2 legs, just like a hairy, like a boy about the age of 12 or whatever. Then it dropped onto its 4 legs, so it's quadrupedal.
Oh,
and it walked past them, and then on this flat bit of land, and then it dropped, and it said it had no tail, because I was asking me what kind of animal was that, and then it picked up it when it went down the slope. It was only 20, 30 feet from them, and then it got up on its hind legs and continued running down. And the family lived in that area for 1.5 years, and except for that one spectacular call one night, otherwise no. And I was always off in the bush exploring and looking, hoping to see one of these things or to see anything, because there's all kinds of wonderful glossy black cockatoos and yellow-tailed black cockatoos and all kinds of wonderful animals. You don't see the birds more than the mammals, but I never found any evidence of this thing. And then here we are living in an area not too far away in Byron Shire, and we've had several encounters. But I mean, I go out every night. There's virtually nothing. Might see a bandicoot or a swamp wallaby. We have echidnas, and we have brush-tailed possums and bush rats, and that's about it. Squirrel glide.
You're making me homesick for Australia. I do love America, but I do miss some of those creatures.
So wonderful.
So how do people find you on Facebook? Because I know you've got a couple of Facebook pages.
Yeah, so I've just got my Gary Opit Facebook page, which I mainly put and my wife Carmel, and also puts more interesting scientific subjects and things relating to the environment and to wildlife, etc. But then I've got another site called Australian Cryptozoology Gary Opit. And so Australian Cryptozoology Gary Opit, and I occasionally post things on that. I'm not all that active. If you really want to get into seeing what's online, definitely contact Dean Harrison and AYR, Australian Yowie Research, Yowie Hunters. There's a whole array of other wonderful Facebook sites. And for books, there's fabulous books. Rex and Heather Gilroy. Rex unfortunately passed away just recently. They're called Uru Publication, URU, and they've published a number of fabulous books. And then, of course, definitely purchase yourself a copy of Tony Healy and Paul Cropper's latest book, The Yowie Files. And then, of course, there's some other fabulous books. Look, this is, if I can find it just here.
Gary, you were the greatest gentleman I've ever had on this show. Nobody pushes other people's books. You've pushed everybody's book but your own.
Yeah. Australian Big Cats. This is a fabulous fabulous book by Michael Williams and Rebecca Lang. Another worthwhile book. And I'm the only cryptozoologist that's actually published a scientific paper on cryptozoology, and it's in the Australian Zoologist. Dangerous Ideas in Zoology. That's the only reason I decided I'd publish I'd present a presentation, and I stood up in front of 100 of Australia's top zoologists at the Australian Museum in Sydney. I've been for 6 years a member of the Royal Zoological Society in New South Wales, and so I put together this study, and that's it there. So as far as I know, that's the only general cryptological article ever published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal.
Wow.
And it's called Citizen Science and Cryptozoology, data received from listeners during 18 years of Wildlife Talkback on ABC, North Coast New South Wales local radio. And this scientific journal, so this is the oldest, most respectable zoological journal in Australia. And this is the first time Yowies, or Bigfoot, Australian Bigfoot, appears. So there's the very first illustration of the Yowie from 1912 in the Sun newspaper.
Goodness me.
It's a wonderful researcher by the name of Pixie Burns, and she illustrated this animal that she had a very close view of in northeastern New South Wales, Tweed Shire, and so that's one of the most detailed illustrations of a Yowie. It sat down in front of her, and it had 3 sticks in its hand. She could see moths in its fur, and a wonderful lady by the name of Diane Smith painted that illustration. It's the first painted illustration. Here they are in a scientific journal,
and you also tell Pixie Burns' story again in your book, Australian Cryptozoology. There's a whole chapter to Pixie's story in that book.
Yeah. No, I regarded her research as the most detailed. The reason that women, I think, are better able at researching Yowies and probably Bigfoot than men, because the Yowies know, or the Bigfoot Sasquatch, they know what we are, because they must be peering out and looking at us and what have you from time to time, in rural localities at least. And they must know that, and because they've also, if they exist and they appear to from all of the anecdotal evidence, that they've lived with, in your case, American Indians, First Nation American people, for thousands of years. They've certainly lived with Indigenous Australian First Nation people for thousands of years, and of course with Westerners these days. And they know that men are dangerous, and they know that, like, that when we act differently to, say, kangaroos or deer. So if you disturb, make a noise, and deer or kangaroos hear something, they'll turn around, they'll look around like this, and then they'll go for their life. They act like predators. They act like prey, and so a predator animal goes, oh, that's something I can eat. They're not dangerous, But if you make a noise in the bush and you notice, and that people hear that, they come running to see what's going on.
Yeah, that's true.
And they know, and they would watch people and they go, oh, those animals, we wouldn't know that we're called people or humans or Homo sapiens. Those animals are dangerous. Look, they act like they're the bosses, like they're not frightened of anything. And it's the same thing with us. If you see an animal that's not frightened of you, you go for your life. If a lion or approaches you, you go, this animal's dangerous. I'm getting out of here.
And here in America too, we draw. Like if I was in my back 40 and I heard some noise I didn't know, my handgun would come off my belt. You know what I mean? Like I'd be holding. And so they're probably used to, if they're physical animals, they're probably used to seeing that as well.
And that's that little Nimbinji. I'm just trying to get it there. That's that little hairy people, Nimbinjis or Janjadis, and they're the footprints that I photographed, all published in this scientific journal.
People get that on Amazon? Is that book available on Amazon or the journal?
You can get it from the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales, and it was only published because they wanted dangerous ideas in cryptozoology. And so I gave this talk to all the top zoologists, and they applauded. I didn't know what the reaction was, and I showed them that. I showed them that footprint, the first time a Yowie, unknown hominid footprint's been exhibited at a zoological meeting, and they awarded me the bravest presentation.
Wow!
And they said that, oh look, most of us have also received these reports, but none of us have ever acted on them because they're just too bizarre. And of course, you have to understand, some people will attack scientists or zoologists or whatever. But remember, as in every other field, these are all specialists. So, they might be zoologists, but they're not studying all of zoology. They're studying particular animals, particular behavior or particular aspects of particular animal species, a whole array of things, every kind of ecologist, and there's so many scientific fields. But I'm one of the few people that have always been in a more holistic understanding of reality. And so I've been interested in the whole field. So I don't have any favourites. I in my radio show, I have to instantly identify every mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, or invertebrate. And I identify the plants. I'm mostly retired now. I'm 75. But I'm interested in the whole array of things, and because of that, also I come from a time that was more saner, and you had time to investigate things. Where now, if you're not working yourself to death, you can't pay the rent and pay the bills. We're in a disastrous situation at the moment because of greed, particularly from the criminal elements who rule the world now. You can imagine all the drug dealers and every criminal on earth, especially through the internet. They've bought up all the houses in Australia, for instance. You can't find a house under $1 million now, and the rents are going up. So people can't even afford to rent anymore. It's an absolutely disastrous situation. But I come from an era where none of that existed, and I had the opportunity, because I was coming from dwelling in a wealthy nation and with a small population, a lot of resources, and being a privileged white male. And so I had even more opportunities, and I understood right from the beginning that how unbelievably fortunate was I that I had the time to look into things, because most people on earth, you're born into your particular culture, and particularly if you're in most countries, you can't even think outside that culture. Like, you can't think outside that religion, or you have to behave along with those cultural lines, which is to be expected. It's perfectly natural. But in a place like Australia, it's so far removed from the rest of the world, we have virtually no security problems. Even migrants have the great difficulty of even trying to get to the place. We've had the luxury of being able to spend more time educating ourselves, and once again, it's not that we're more wonderful or anything than anything else. It's just part of it's part of the environment, and so the United States, of course, being a very resource-rich place, you have enormous amount of competition for those resources. But Australia was always a resource-poor place. And so mateship or community was more important than competition. You had to work together to survive, especially in the early days. Not these days, it's different altogether. And that's why generally the Australians are a lot more sort of community-minded and welcoming and friendly, because we live in this wonderful environment that doesn't suffer from extreme overcrowding or threats from neighbours. Yeah, so... Anyway, I've gone on for too long.
No, Gary, to be honest, you are I've never done a Talking Weird this long. You've broken the record of the Talking Weird runtime. You're in the Guinness Book of Talking Weird as the longest guest. You were just a delight, though. I mean, as one of our listeners, who is Jamie Leonardo, who runs another show on this network called Down South Anomalies, which is fantastic. We should try to get you on Jamie's show. You'd be a great guest for him. He was saying how you could do coast to coast like yourself. You could be the host. You could just fill the whole few hours, because you're so fascinating. You're an incredibly fascinating person. I had a great time talking to you. We'll have to get you back on. Next time we'll do the ET book.
Yeah, because I named 30 species of extraterrestrial scientific biological classification. I did it over 20 years ago, and was published in a local journal, and it was all based on, it's purely anecdotal contact, purely academic reports from newspapers and magazines for 100 years, from 1870 to 1970, and I biologically classified with scientific names, families, orders, etc. Yeah, about 30 species of extraterrestrial. Whether they exist or not, who knows? Once again, it's like cryptological things. I'm fascinated by the reports. I take down the information and then I share it. Yeah.
Let's do that next time.
Yeah, we can talk on. I'll identify all the extraterrestrials for you.
I can't wait. Gary, great joy. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for everybody who joined us in the chat and is watching and listening or watching us on repeat later. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform, please subscribe to the Untold Radio Network. We just love having you all watching and listening to us. And until I get to chat to you guys again, and I love your hat, Gary, keep it weird.
All the best.